everybody, it's Aggie and welcome to episode 8 of DPSI Law with Aggie. Today I have a very special guest in the Meet the Trainer segment, João Madeira from Global Language Services Limited, and he is a trainer, author and a DPSI exam expert who is going to talk to us today about the best strategies for sitting and passing your DPSI exam, but also he is going to give us some very useful insights about the interpreting industry, about the expectations from interpreters, and about the tender process and how it is that you get to do what you do. So I'd like to cordially invite you to watch this segment. Hello and welcome to another Meet the Trainer segment of DPSI with Aggie. Today I have a great pleasure of hosting João Madeira, conference interpreter and a translator English to Portuguese, a business consultant, a GCSE examiner. He's based in Scotland. He's also a published author of 3 books, a father of 3 and a musician, so a veritable Renaissance man. So tell me, João, if did I miss anything out, and feel free to correct me.
No, I think that's enough, isn't it?
Quite a lot.
Too busy
So
doing too many things.
yeah, I'm very, very thankful to you, João, for taking some time out of your probably immensely busy schedule. I mean, fatherhood's
pleasure.
probably like a job in itself.
Yeah, that's something you missed, actually. I'm a father of 3 small children, and that in itself keeps me super busy, trying to combine everything.
But so I've mentioned that you're Portuguese to English linguist, a translator, and an interpreter. So today we're going to talk about your experiences and your advice as a tutor in DPSI. So you work for a centre. Can you remind us what the centre is called?
I'm the head tutor for a DPSI course for a centre in Scotland called Global Language Services Limited.
And what languages can the candidates be tutored in?
Technically, we accept all languages. We don't make distinction in languages. Doesn't mean that we necessarily take them on the course, but in theory, the course is open to anybody.
So am I correct in understanding that all the languages covered by the DPSI, which is about 30, you would be able to tutor a candidate of each of those languages?
Yeah, yes. So those languages and more sometimes. The way the DPSI works is that they publish that list of languages on the website every year, and every year it changes slightly. And with that language, there's always a disclaimer saying we don't guarantee that the exam will be offered in this language or any other language. That's the CIOL's disclaimer, right? It's just an indication that these are the most common languages we expect the exam will be offered in. And in addition to that, obviously, there's more languages that are offered. And I think the institutes actually stopped advertising that language to avoid confusion and just protect their own back, I suppose. So we accept students not just for the list of languages on the website, but for every other language. Obviously, that creates sometimes logistical issues. When we get students for rare languages, sometimes we end up with courses where we might only have 1 or 2 students for Thai or for Turkish, which in essence is these days a rare language. But yeah, it's this kind of logistical challenges we're used to dealing with. Yeah.
And are your courses provided on a face-to-face basis or remotely, or is it a mixture of the two?
At the moment, it's still fully remote. So we used to be a face-to-face course only, and with the lockdown, as many other courses, we just moved online, and then we realized that works quite well. It's most people, not everybody, so it's most people. So we've continued with that provision. We might start face-to-face courses again, but possibly not this year. It's something we're looking at in the future because there's a different demographic that would prefer face-to-face courses. So we're kind of keen to go back to doing that, but not for the foreseeable future. Yeah.
I presume it's a bit of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it's more available to do remotely, but on the other hand, you miss that human connection, don't you? And that personal touch.
Yeah, it's really nice, when we started doing the DPSI online, especially, and people were kind of desperate to just see each other and so on. And there were some people that were clearly there in the course just to so they could hang out and have
That's nice
chat,
too.
Yeah, which is look, I always say it's a valid reason for doing a course. If you're willing to put in the effort as well, apart from the social side of it, is a perfectly valid reason for doing a course. And we had people from all over the place. We had a girl in Israel doing the course.
Wow.
We had people all over the world, and it was really nice. And clearly the DPSI is not for them really, but it's something they wanted to do anyway because they wanted to do an interpreting qualification, and that's something they could do online, and they just wanted to see other people and talk and learn more about interpreting and so on. But on the other hand, like you said, there's a different connection when, you're sitting there in a room with people. There's a different interaction. And not only that, I would say, but in my experience, there's a certain demographic we used to get a lot in our face-to-face courses, which we just do not get in any online course. And I don't want to stereotype too much, but this is just my observation. We used to get a high percentage of older people, especially women, especially of Asian origin, for example, because they'd been mothers, the kids were grown up, and they wanted to do something to kind of be looking at maybe a new career option or retraining or just meeting other people or just doing something interesting or just socializing even. Every year at the start of a course, we'd have the usual introductions. What's your main motivation for being here today? And lots of people would quite openly say, I'm here just to kill time. I'm here because I've got nothing else to do, And like I said, that's a valid reason. And some of them went on to be really great, successful interpreters. So it's really nice. And also other people as well. If you've got a busy family home, it's very difficult to find like a private space to sit there and work in front of a computer. So even if some people might want to, it's difficult. And I know that fine well because I've got 3 small children. I struggle sometimes with teaching sessions without getting interrupted by a 3-year-old coming, Daddy, come and read me a story while I'm trying to teach a class, So yeah, I think the online thing is great, really suits lots of people. But like you said, there's just something missing and it doesn't suit everybody. So we're keen to going back to doing the face-to-face thing as well. But we'll see. Hopefully in the near future.
That's such a lovely inspirational story, really. So just to touch on that, when you said Asian, do you mean speakers of Urdu, Punjabi and Gujarati, those languages? Or
mostly. I mean, like I said, I don't want to stereotype too much, but yeah, quite a high percent from that background, from that region of Asia. Yeah.
I think that's brilliant. I think it's really great to promote like learning for people who are already established, have careers, children, families, because it's not just a young person's game interpreting. Sometimes we might have that perception that, you go to college and then you do languages and then you become an interpreter, but you don't always have to start this path straight away. And indeed, I mean, you've mentioned in your LinkedIn profile that you have been a working linguist for 25 years. Tell us what portion of this has been tutoring people in DPSI. How long have you been doing this for?
I did my DPSI in 2003.
Wow.
And I started tutoring 2 years later, if I'm not mistaken, 2005. That's what, 18 years maybe?
Wow,
something like that.
That's almost 2 decades. Yeah. That's a long time.
Making me feel old.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is. No, it's okay. It's one of those things. Time just flies, yeah. But yeah, quite a long time. Let's just say quite a long time.
Quite a long time. Okay, fair enough. Are you teaching just generic exam skills, the skills necessary for passing the exam, to put it quite simply, the consecutive, simultaneous sight and translation? Or do you specialize in any languages when it comes to tutoring?
So our courses, I started doing the DPSI in 2005, and the DPSI has existed since before then.
And 89 was established.
Yeah, and we had the input of some kind of established tutors at the time, and they were involved in teaching some of the courses. And I then started teaching a course in the Highlands, actually in Inverness. And I launched, or not I, the company I used to work for launched a distance learning course, which I wrote. And then it kind of went on from there. And then I started teaching more and more. And then eventually I became the head tutor for the courses. So our course provision has actually changed over time. And the focus of what we teach has changed over time as we became better at realizing, actually, this course doesn't fully meet the needs of the students. And that's the way I suppose any course should work, because if a course has been the same for 20 years, then the odds are it's probably not a very good course. It should change and should evolve. The DPSI itself has evolved. As you know, we've just had some significant changes recently.
We did.
And I know you've got another video about that, so people can go and watch that. So it's evolved and it's still evolving. Okay, but to answer your question more directly, I suppose, we teach them. So there's a big part of the exam where we focus on exam skills, because a big part of the course where we focus on exam skills, because the main purpose of the course at the end of the day is to help people pass the DPSI. And that's what we want. So to give them all the tools, all the skills that they need to pass the exam, but also teach them all the tricks and all the little loopholes, not loopholes, but shortcuts.
Like do's and don'ts.
They can use to that kind of stuff, and little things that can make a big difference, all that kind of stuff that you get in a course that you don't necessarily get when preparing by yourself, because you don't have previous experience from sitting these kind of examinations. So obviously there's a big part of it. These days we've got maybe about, say, 40 odd students a year, or 60 students, depends, but only a small percentage of them go on to do the DPSI, the actual exam, because the actual exam is really expensive. It costs £895. Just round it up is basically £1,000 by the time you buy your headphones and whatnot. One thing I realized a number of years ago was that not everybody's going to do the exam even if they want to, because they just can't afford it. So then the thing was, well, do we really want to have a course that's just aimed at helping people pass the exam, or can we make sure that people take something out of it even if they don't sit the exam? So then I decided to change the content of the course. These days, basically, we spent a lot of time doing drills and working on the skills you need to pass the exam and familiarizing yourself with the units and working through past papers and mock scenarios and all that stuff. But then we also focus on some of the areas that you will encounter as public service interpreters, which will be useful for you in professional life, whether you do the exam or not.
Such as?
So, in Scotland, things like children's panels, for example, you will never get a DPSI paper on children's panels because it's completely different in England, and just the way they set the papers. It's a huge part, and there's so many jobs for interpreters out there because every time you've got a children's hearing, there's an interpreter involved. So we spent a bit of time talking about that. And then other things which are maybe relevant for the exam or not, such as court interpreting and the court system and how that works. But then we delve a little bit deeper. We actually talk about the practicalities of it. Okay, when you go to court, this is what happens. This is how you might be involved as an interpreter. This is who you report to. This is who signs your timesheet. This is who contracts interpreters for these parties, for this side of the proceedings. Wow. This is who contracts interpreters. So we go into all of that just to give people a good understanding of how it works, whether they do the exam or not. So then they can hopefully go on to do court work, maybe if they want to, or if they've got that possibility, or if they're suited to that, whether they've went on to do the DPS or not. Same thing with police station proceedings, health option. We might go into the different kind of jobs you might get, day surgery, primary care. Also, my main objective these days is to make sure that when someone finishes the course, they're a competent interpreter and translator in general. Not a qualified interpreter, but competent interpreter. And what that means is, like I said, a bit to prepare for the exam, but really that you know how to deal with problems. Because as you know, it doesn't matter how much you study, it doesn't matter how many jobs you've done, it doesn't matter if you've been working for 25 years, there's always going to be a job with something that you don't know, with a situation you've never encountered before, with something you didn't expect, with some terminology you don't know, always, because of the nature of the profession. And then it's like, how do you deal with that? Do you just make a random decision every time you encounter a difficulty? Or is there a framework of guidance that you can use, general professional guidelines that you can apply to help your decision making and to make sure you don't get in trouble? Because we're all freelance workers. The whole industry in the UK works on a freelance basis. So you go to court, you mess up, the courts call the agency and say, don't send us this interpreter again because he messed up. And that's your last job as a court interpreter. So do you want to be at the mercy of making a mistake and that's you done? Or do you want to somehow have a way of protecting yourself from making those kind of stupid mistakes? So we kind of look at things like that and give people guidance that should hopefully avoid that kind of situations from happening. And so quite often these are very kind of simple. It's just making sure that you're clear on how to apply these kind of things. But sorry, long answer to a short question.
Okay. No, this is very interesting because it shows that your course is more comprehensive than just will lead you to guide you how to pass the exam and that's it, because you delve into the everyday practicalities of interpreting, which is really something, like you said, that's not really covered by courses because every court is different. So this is incredibly valuable. So let's look at the course itself and let's look at the format of the classes. So first of all, how long are the courses that you provide?
The length of the course itself varies from year to year, but generally speaking, we normally start sometime in November and the course goes on to the middle of June, to the week before the exams. So normally the exams are on the third week of June. So normally our course starts in November and finishes on the second week of June. And basically the format, so we've got one Zoom meeting once per week for 3 hours. We've got different options available. So it's either an evening or a weekend. This year we're only offering the evening option. So there's one Zoom 3-hour meeting. And then on top of that, you get different additional materials. So you've got pre-recorded materials. Some of them are just kind of theoretical videos on some of the topics covered in the classes. Some of them are recorded videos for drills, for example, for simultaneous interpreting drills. We've got a class server we share with students with materials as well. So they've got access to materials for additional home practice. For some of these might be just reading materials, for example. Some of them might be short glossaries on a specific topic, but also things like worksheets on certain topics that we might be covering in the class, mock role plays, mock site translations, past papers, all that kind of stuff. So we share all of that through basically a shared server.
Thank you. I've mentioned at the beginning while introducing you about your books. Would you like to tell us about your books? Because I presume they're extremely useful materials for any prospective candidates.
Go and buy them.
Yes, buy the books.
That's it. I've published some books. One of them is a glossary, a Scottish law glossary for practicing interpreters. And this is something I compiled over the period of about 15 years or so. I didn't start it as a project to print a glossary, go to court and encounter terminology, and I'll take a note of it and I'll go home, maybe something I didn't know, and then I would research it, kind of put it into an Excel spreadsheet. So then when I had my next court job, I'd quickly go through my glossary, especially initially because I wouldn't get that many. And kind of obviously over time you start getting more and more, but initially you don't, generally speaking. And then these days I do mostly translation, and that's really my specialization. And you're doing translation, and I specialize in legal documents. So every time you've got a legal document and you're researching terms on the internet, today I'm doing a divorce thing, tomorrow I'll be doing a human trafficking case, the next day I'm doing a rape case, and it's always different topics. And then I'll be doing maybe a divorce thing again, but the last divorce document I did was about 6 months ago, and I've already forgotten half the terminology. So I find myself kind of researching the same terms over and over again and trying to remember, how did I translate this thing last time? So I started compiling this thing, and then eventually there was so much on it, I thought, I'm just going to publish it.
Awesome.
The other books I published, so I published a book of role plays for Scots Law and for health, and a book of just exercises for Scots Law and for health as well. So it's not something that's essential for anyone doing the DPSI, but I feel that they will go a long way in helping. If you're working through past papers and there's only so many past papers for your language,
exactly.
You can buy the books and you've got another 15 role plays there. The Scots Law in particular, what I try to do as well, there's different topics covered, and some of them are kind of topics that are quite common for the exam, but similarly, there's some topics there which are what I feel a fair, accurate reflection of what you get in real life in Scotland. So, for example, if you're called to interpret at a police station interview, the language I try to use in my role plays are pretty close to the language that police officers actually use and what they actually say. Obviously, I couldn't sit there at a police interview and actually write down literally what they say, but, go outside and just take some notes. And after so long, you remember, because they always use the same kind of formats, as I'm sure it's the same thing in England. I feel that they're good resources. And if anybody's preparing for the DPSI, you'll be supporting me. Hopefully they'll be useful for people as well. So yeah.
Thank you. For anyone who's interested, the links to Joao's books will be in the video description, so you can purchase them and practice. I'm sure they'll be extremely useful. So we talked about the length of the classes and we talked about the length of the course, and something that I always like to touch on, this is my teaching background. In language teaching, you always do an assessment, you always do a needs analysis. For example, does this person need more written skills, oral skills, whichever? Do you do the same thing for your candidates? Do you take a snapshot picture of what the level of skills are and advise them, for example, to maybe do more of one thing or the other?
The short answer, yes, to an extent, but there's the long answer. Going back to the nature of our course, there's a big variance to the kind of students we take in our course. Some courses out there, you've got an initial assessment to make sure that you're at a certain standard and so on, and there's nothing wrong about that. But when we started our course, our motivation for offering DPSI courses was not necessarily to be the best center in the country, which will never be. It was to make the DPSI available to people that normally wouldn't do it and cover their languages. And so by definition,
so maybe not your typical language student or someone with linguistic background.
Not at all. But we do get those as well. But basically what we end up is with class with very mixed abilities.
Okay.
Yeah? We do get graduates from conference interpreting master degrees coming on and joining the DPSI course. But at the same time, we've got someone who doesn't even have a university degree.
Right.
The kids are grown up now and they're looking for a job. So they thought, I'm going to do this DPSI to try and become an interpreter.
Yeah,
which is a perfectly valid reason.
Absolutely.
And in reality, I would rather have a course just full of those kind of people. Not to say that I don't like the conference interpreters. I do love them because they bring like an added dimension to the course, which is very valuable, especially to the colleagues. But I think it's important to have this kind of mix. And it's something I really value a lot. So we do have an informal assessment. It's not terribly strict. The main assessment is, can you speak both languages and can you write both languages to competent level? If you can, then technically, if you're willing to put the effort in, you could be an interpreter. That's our personal view. Then during the course, then basically what that means as well is that during the course, we might have some issues because some people will engage with the learning format and the materials quite easily because they're used to doing kind of independent learning
academic.
Yeah, exactly. Higher education, but especially postgraduate level where you do a lot of independent learning, research and so on. I mean, we're used to doing that. It's fine as a translator. That's the kind of thing you do every day. As an interpreter, that's the kind of thing you do every day. But someone who's never studied at higher education level, who's never done any interpretation, who doesn't really understand any of these concepts, it's actually quite difficult.
It is.
Initially. So we try and support them as much as possible. And we do kind of informal assessments. So this is the other thing as well. We don't like the assessments to be too formal because some people will get very discouraged, especially when comparing themselves to their colleagues, and they just give up from personal experience. So we try to give personalized feedback. This is the things you personally need to work on, or we try and give them guidance. Okay, do this exercise, do that exercise, and do that exercise. That should tell you what you need to work on. And I can support you in that. We do kind of mock translations, for example, into English. We'll mark their English and say, well, this is not a language course, but these are the areas you need to go and work on by yourself. You know, you need to work on your prepositions, or you need to work on your verb tenses, or you need to work on your articles. Lots of speakers from different languages struggle with those kind of things. And it's not just turn up for the class and watch the class and hopefully you pass the exam. It's a bit more involved than that. There's certainly informal assessments throughout the course.
Brilliant. So there's really a lot of inclusivity in your approach to learners. And am I correct in saying that the community element is very important? Like you were saying earlier, that you are quite keen to start it to be face-to-face again rather than just Zoom. It's quite inclusive and kind of community oriented, if you will. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. That's quite a strong element. I think also when you're in a learning environment, I think that community or peer support element, community engagement within your circle of peers is really important for the learning experience to make it more enjoyable, but also for motivation and achievements. You're much more likely to be successful if you've got a group of peers that you engage with and they're kind of supporting you and you're supporting them in your learning experience rather than just sitting there reading through past papers. I think that's a very important element in the course. And also, you know, the work as interpreters, especially these days where you're doing a lot of remote interpreting, can be very lonely, can be quite isolating. The DPSI is really an opportunity to meet more people. If you're coming into the profession to meet people that are already maybe doing it, or they've got that conference interpreting degree of being interpreting for 10 years and are now doing their DPSI, or if you're a practicing interpreter, you come in and you meet some colleagues that actually they've been working for as long as you have, but you've never met them. You can exchange ideas and experiences.
Absolutely.
So it's a forum for doing that.
That's very valuable. Thank you for that. So we've talked about your long career in teaching the DPSI. Can you tell us what made you start offering this training 2 years after you passed your own exam?
At the time, I was a senior manager for an interpreting agency, and it wasn't just my decision. I did my DPSI in 2003, and I had been trying to do it for several years, but at the time, the only place in Scotland where you could do it was Cardonald College, and they would only offer a language if they had at least 3 students for that language. So I tried for a couple of years, which is fair enough. I think a lot of centres do that still these days. So I tried to enroll, and there was never any students year after year. And then eventually I convinced my brother and another friend to do it so there could be 3 of us. And I had asked them, I had asked them so much that they offered Portuguese 1 year and there was the 3 of us. And we fortunately, all of us passed in the end. We worked really hard together. It was good. And then in 2001, I started working for an agency, and I said to them, so I said my DPSI, I was like, we're doing court work, we're doing police work, we're doing NHS, and we really need more DPSI interpreters for all these languages. So why don't we offer this course? Why don't we contact the Chartered Institute of Linguists and ask them, can we offer this course? So the directors loved that idea, and that's what we did. The main motivation really is because there was just such a huge shortage of interpreters back then. I mean, there's still a huge shortage these days, but there was even greater shortage those days. I mean, there was no one with a DPSI in Polish back then. There was very few people with a DPSI in Portuguese. You know, things have changed significantly. There's still a huge shortage, but at least there's a lot of people out there. So that was really the main motivation, just to kind of get more qualified interpreters into the industry. And as an agency, because I was working for an agency, that was an appealing idea to them, because if you think about it, you know, quite often I think people can misjudge agencies to an extent, and obviously they're not all the same. Every agency is different. Absolutely. But they're not all bad, you know. And to think that agencies don't care about quality, they just care about money. Well, yeah, sure, they care about money because that's the reason why they exist. But it's not that they don't care about quality. One of the things we discussed, you know, because I was a senior manager and we had lots of these discussions, was, let's imagine we get a court complaint. Every time we get a complaint, not only is it bad for reputation, it's bad for a contract, it's bad for everybody involved, but it costs us a lot of money to deal with it. Because there wasn't any DPSI interpreters back then, or very few, how do we know if someone is good if nobody's got any qualifications and very few people have got experience? How do we know? We can get some basic training and so on, but even we didn't know that much back then. So it was that kind of thing. Well, if we can get more professional interpreters, and if nobody else is doing it, we'll train them, then we will have a higher profile within the industry, we'll increase standards across the board, but also for ourselves, because obviously there was a commercial interest in it, and we'll make more money, because not that we're making more money in the job itself, but we're making more money overall because we're not wasting so much time dealing with complaints and whatnot.
You can provide more consistency in terms of quality.
Yeah, that was really the main motivation. There was a mixture of personal interests and so on, but also commercial interests, obviously.
That's a brilliant story. It's nice to see that you basically responded to the needs of the market.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you established something that's going to work as an advantage to all colleagues who want to be upskilled, which is my strong belief that as interpreters, there's always something we can learn. There's always places where we can improve. That's very important. I am guessing you've mentioned before we sat down to the interview that you were having classes on Tuesday and Wednesday evening, 3 hours. I believe that you must have a real passion and you must have a real love of what you do. And if indeed that's the case, what do you like about teaching and tutoring DPSI candidates?
It's something you don't do for the money, because the money in teaching is not as good as the money you make from translation, for example. But teaching is something that's very rewarding because you're working with people. And there's that kind of thing I mentioned before, of especially if you do mostly translation and not even interpreting, as I do these days. So, being able to sit there with a class and work with real people is something that's really invaluable. But the main thing that I find rewarding is, once again, what I was mentioning before. When you get a good student from the start, from day one, they've got an MA in translation or an MSc in conference interpreting or whatever, that there's a good chance they're going to pass, and there's a good chance they're going to put in the work and so on to kind of work towards it, because they've proved that already through their prior qualifications. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to pass, but there's a good chance. So it's nice to work with those people because they're good, and I'm also learning from them. Sometimes I get interpreters doing the course that have more experience than I. It's also an opportunity for me to personally to learn from them and from their stories and from the feedback, and sometimes the way they work, and kind of get little tips and so on. But what I take really personally great pleasure in is when I get those people who've never done anything, they don't have any qualifications, and it's the kind of people that you wouldn't even dream of investing in them from a commercial point of view. And then when you see those people get the DPSI and become full-time interpreters and really enjoy their work, so that's very satisfying. Very satisfying when you feel like you've made a difference, I suppose. One thing I would like to say, I don't know if you're planning to ask me this question or not. One thing I would like to say is that I don't teach the full course. So we've got a team of tutors. I used to teach the full course before the lockdown. When the lockdown happened and we moved the provision online, there was already some other tutors involved, but I decided I can't do all of these. I've got small kids and so on. But also, I shouldn't be doing all of these, because really it's most beneficial if people have got a team of tutors who are all providing their own input and professional experience and way of doing things. And it's not just, João said you should do things this way. No, it's like you can get different angles. So we've got a team of tutors that all work together, and we've got a rota system. So I do some of the classes, they do some of the classes, and we focus on different things. And they speak different languages as well. So they provide additional support to people that speak those languages as well. And sometimes they do things differently for me. And within our team of tutors, we don't all agree on everything. There are some professional issues we disagree on. So it's quite interesting sometimes for the students as well to get that input. Such and such said these, and I'll say, well, this is my view, this is her view. We agree to disagree. And that's the way she does things, this is the way I do things. They're both valid approaches.
Absolutely. I think that's brilliant to have that variety and to have that diversity, because, we all have the codes of conduct, we all have rules and the guidelines. But every now and again, you will encounter a situation where you have to react, like you said, really quickly, something unexpected, and you have to kind of go off the book. That's really, really interesting, because indeed there is no universal guideline book for how to do interpreting. And I really like what you said about teaching people who are not attractive from the commercial point of view, because indeed it's quite an easy way to pass. And maybe for someone like myself who did languages, who did an interpreting course, did a translation course after uni, for me DPSI was just like another step. But for someone who perhaps has a completely different set of life experiences, that may be really challenging to grasp those concepts. But at the same time, I really like your approach, and I really like that sense of mission, because I believe firmly that community and public service interpreting is about soft skills and not just language skills.
Yes,
so,
I say that all the time. Thank
do you? Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was
There you
saying,
go.
because there's this thing that people think that a good DPSI course is a course that teaches you terminology. It's like terminology is only like 20% of the package. And there's so many elements to a good interpreter. There's your contextual knowledge, terminology, there's your language skills, there's your people skills, your approachability, whether you have a pleasant face. Or whether you're a very cold person. And obviously, we're all better at some things than others. But soft skills are so important. We're dealing with humans, not machines. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted
Absolutely.
you. Sorry.
No.
I was just so happy you said that.
I'm really glad that you shared this conviction because, for example, if someone is a mother or a grandmother or a carer, they will have extra skills. I have a strong caring background. I cared for my relative, my mom and myself provided pretty much end of life care to a relative, and people just don't realize how life experiences and just how life can enhance you as an interpreter. One example that really comes to mind, where if you looked at it from like the outside, and I am interested in your opinion in this, is when I was assisting someone who was having a quite painful and invasive exam. And, the guidelines teach us to be completely transparent, disinterested, professional. But, if you see someone in distress, in pain, what do you do? Do you just stand there or do you comfort them? I chose to comfort them, stroked her hand and said, okay, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. And I was thinking, like, am I doing the right thing? Am I not overstepping a mark? And I remember this was really, really early, and this was about 8 years ago. I'm really interested in your take on that.
Look, that's one of the things we talk a lot in our course, because it's an opportunity as well for people just to ask that kind of questions, because let's put it in context. Most of the public service interpreting we do these days is through an agency, through an intermediary. The contracts go up to tender, agencies bid for it, agency A gets the contracts, and then we work for agency A, so they're going to give us work and so on and so forth. Then agency B takes the contracts, so then we also work for agency B, so we're going to do work. And they've got these codes of conduct and so on, and these terms and conditions we sign, and they change from time to time and so on. And they're all slightly different, but they're all more or less the same thing, like you were saying. They're all very much like, you'll be dispassionate, and you'll be completely impartial and blah blah blah,
detached,
and so on and so forth. And detached, that kind of thing. And I've got a real problem with it, because in a sense they are correct, because that's what we should do, but then it's not a true reflection of real life. But obviously from a commercial point of view, they can't really say anything else, and then you encounter situations in real life where you can't be detached, and being detached and dispassionate and so on. I know a company director, and whenever he inducts interpreters, that's one of the things he always says. Interpreters have to be dispassionate. They have to be dispassionate. No passion, no emotion, and so on. And I'm thinking, well, I 100% disagree with that. A dispassionate interpreter, public service interpreter we're talking about, is not a good interpreter from my point of view. There has to be an element of empathy, especially, I would say, in appointments like medical, social work, housing, and so on. In legal settings is easier, because of the psychological connection between the client. It's easier to be a little bit more dispassionate. But in other settings, is it good to be completely dispassionate? Sometimes it's not, because that can actually create a barrier to communication. And if that creates a barrier to communication, I would argue that you're not doing a job well as a public service interpreter. The words might be coming out of your mouth, but maybe the patient's not getting them in, or they don't really want to communicate with you. So you've created a barrier to the flow of communication just because of the way you present yourself. So it goes back to what you're saying about soft skills previously. And I think sometimes, people with a little bit more life experience understand that a little bit more. It then creates other problems, because it's not a black and white. From an agency point of view, from a contractual point of view, everybody wants to have hard lines and black and white situations. The reality is that there's no black and whites. There's only lots of gray areas. And as soon as you get into a gray area, it's a gray area by definition. You might get in trouble. And then where do you draw the line, and how do you protect yourself professionally from not having a complaint? Because you then at the mercy of how your actions are interpreted by a client. This is something we could talk about in another video for hours.
Indeed, we could have a special, we could have a dedicated
meeting. Absolutely. I'll just tell you a story. There was this guy called Dilawar Singh, and he's a retired police inspector in Scotland, and he was one of my mentors. He used to do the police training for the company I used to work for, and I learned so much from him. And it was really good to have him and other people, but him in particular as a mentor, because he was working for the forces. So whenever I had any question, I just went to him and said, what does this terminology mean? Or in this situation, what should I have done? That kind of thing. And I could ask him direct. So that was really good. But I remember specifically in the early days when there was about court interpreting, and it's pretty much like you just go into court and you don't know what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be impartial, and you're supposed to interpret everything, and you're supposed to be an independent party. The basics that everybody knows. It didn't go any further than that. Then there was a whole thing about witnesses. How do you interact with witnesses? And we got some instructions from the procurator fiscal.
I was just about to say, is it the same as the Director of Public Prosecution?
CPS.
So what's...
Let's call it the Crown Prosecution Service. But in Scotland, it's called the COPFS, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, more or less the same equivalent.
Okay.
So, but they book interpreters for about prosecution witnesses. Yeah.
Okay.
There was a whole thing, and this was like 20 years ago. There was a whole thing of where they were still kind of trying to figure out standards and so on, where the interpreter should go, where the interpreter should wait. Can they wait in court? Do they need to wait in the witness room because they're not a witness? Can they talk to the witness beforehand? Can they not talk to the witness? All of this kind of stuff that you've got more or less kind of standardized these days. And there was a whole massive discussion, and we'd get calls from the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service sometimes saying, oh, the interpreter was sitting with the witness in the waiting room. They're not supposed to sit with the witness in the waiting room. Or the interpreter is talking to the witness before the case. They're not supposed to talk to the witness. And then someone else is saying, the interpreter refused to go into the witness waiting room. Why did it not? So anyway, so I remember talking to him about it. The whole crux of the question was, you're not supposed to talk about the case with the witness in advance, because if you do, you could, in the eyes of the justice system, you could become biased, you could become contaminated. So, and you're supposed to be an impartial party, so you have, in a sense, to go in, not going blind, but you're not supposed to talk about the case. I was talking to the lawyer at that time, and I was asking for his advice, saying, what do you suggest? Because this is a minefield. What do you do? You know, because at the time, as a company, we decided, okay, we'll just instruct interpreters not to talk to the witness beforehand to avoid that kind of situation. It's easier. Like the whole thing I was saying about black and white, don't talk to the witness, and that's the problem removed. And he said, well, his words were, well, I actually always make a point of talking to the witness. And I was like, what? Yeah, I make a point of talking to the witness. I was like, right. And what about accused? Same thing. I make a point of going and introducing myself and talking to them. This was 20 years ago. This kind of blew my mind. I was like, really?
Yeah.
Because what about impartiality? Is like, well, I know where my professional boundaries are, but think from their point of view. This was his argument. And it made complete sense after explaining. He's like, think from their point of view. You've got this witness or this accused person. Just because he's an accused person doesn't mean he's guilty or she's guilty. You've got this person there. They're emotional. They're stressed. They're under a lot of pressure. They're going through these very scary proceedings, whether they're an accused or a witness. And just going in and introducing yourself, it helps them relax. It helps them feel at ease. It's going to make your job easier. It's going to make my job as an interpreter easier. So I make a point of going there and talking about the weather or whatever. Not the case, obviously, but talk about anything. And that made complete sense to me.
So establishing a little bit of a rapport beforehand, and then explaining your role, saying that you're going to be their interpreter, you're going to interpret everything faithfully without omitting anything. I do the same thing. I always greet service users and I tell them that I am a court interpreter and I'm going to be interpreting for them in court.
Yeah.
I do draw a line at people sometimes try to help and they say, I'm going to explain the case, and I say, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there.
Don't they?
And I say, I don't need this information. The less I know, the better. Because I always say we're going back to those soft skills. We're humans. And sometimes you can't help but sympathize with someone. And that's where that really gray area begins, really. Because you shouldn't have an interest. Oh, he looks like a right solid bloke. I'm going to help him get off. And that's like, no, that's not what we do.
Yeah. It really is. And sometimes there's that kind of need for the person they see someone from their own country and from the culture and so on that they identified. And there's somehow the need to justify themselves. Yeah. Oh, right. Let me tell you what happened. This is all a big misunderstanding. No, let's not talk about it. And it's very difficult sometimes to manage that. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
That's brilliant. So I'm hoping that our viewers enjoyed this incredibly insightful taster of what court legal interpreting can be, not only if you're in Scotland, but whether you're in Wales, Northern Ireland, England. Thank you so much for that, João.
My pleasure.
Just to wrap up our interview, if you were to give 3 pieces of advice to prospective DPSI candidates, 3 nuggets of wisdom, what would you tell them?
Wow, 3 for DPSI candidates, practice. I'll just reduce 3 nuggets of wisdom into 1 nugget of wisdom. Okay. Practice. Practice. Join a course, or if you don't want to join a course, if you can't join a course, practice. And don't leave it to the last minute. Just, I was watching one of your videos the other day when you're talking about your 5 top tips, I think it was. That was a really useful video that people should go and watch. And you talked about front loading, and that makes perfect sense. Don't leave it to the last minute, because life will get in the way and professional life is going to get in the way. Practice well in advance. The skills you need to pass the exam are not skills you acquire within 2 weeks. The skills you acquire over a period of time. You don't become a good translator in 2 weeks, practicing 10 hours a day. It doesn't work that way. No. It's a bit like becoming a musician or going to the gym and getting fit. You can't do it in 2 days. It takes months, of regular work. And becoming a good interpreter and a good translator is the same thing. So somehow find a practice schedule that works for you. It doesn't mean you need to work 2 hours at a time or have a 3-hour lesson if that doesn't fit within your personal life.
Yeah, it doesn't always work, does it? Yeah.
It doesn't always work, but if you can find 10 minutes at a time or 20 minutes minutes at a time, a few times a week. If you start well in advance, that's going to make a huge difference. It's going to make much bigger difference than starting at the last minute. So just don't spend too much time. I suppose that would be my second tip. Don't get too stressed memorizing terminology and memorizing glossaries. That's, in my view, it's not pointless work. There is some benefits to it, but there's only limited benefit to it. What's going to get you to pass the exam or not is whether you're a good interpreter. And the examiners can spot good interpreters or people that have practiced, even if you might be struggling with some of the terminology involved. And just studying glossaries is not going to pass you the exam. Being a good interpreter is going to pass you the exam. So be sensible how you use your time, especially if you've got limited time. Don't just say, okay, I'm going to sit here for 10 minutes today, just memorizing some terminology, especially if it's out of context. You're never going to remember it. Instead of doing that, just put a YouTube video on or put a TV on, do 10 minutes of simultaneous practice, or pick up a newspaper article or just random thing off the internet,
Just
do a bit of text
anything.
translation practice.
Yeah.
Anything. As long as you're practicing those skills that you're going to need, then that's it. So that would be my main advice. Just practice, and practice some more. And that's going to pass you the exam.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, João. I'm so happy that you've chose to be
Thank you
here
for
with us.
inviting me.
That's my pleasure. So for those of you who would like to know more about Joao's offerings, so the course he's the head tutor at, you can find all the information in the video description. If perhaps you want to enroll or if you want to look at his books, he also has a YouTube channel where he breaks down legal system of Scotland and indeed dedicated DPSI videos. So you can check it all out in the description. And thank you so much again, João, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. It's been so nice talking to you.
Thank you so
Hopefully we
much.
can do this again sometime.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
absolutely. Thank you so much. Since you're a Portuguese speaker, could you say goodbye in Portuguese to us?
Adeus e até à próxima. Cumprimentos.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Okay. In today's Resource Corner, I would like to present another very useful website with a lot of free courses for you to look at in your spare time from the Open University this time. They do obviously have paid for courses, diploma, certificates and degree level education, but you can also find some free content, and one of those that I have been doing myself is a course called Applying Social Work Law with Children and Families. This is a very interesting self-study course which delves into such concepts as social work, the child rights, parental responsibilities, children's welfare, children-centered approach and so on. And it presents these issues and concepts from different points of view. So not only English legislation is mentioned, but also Scottish and Northern Irish. And in order to access this course, you need to go to the Open University website. So in order to get access to those free courses, you need to go to this website called Open Learn, free learning from the Open University, and you can browse all of the free courses, and you need to create an account and you need to be signed in to access them, but that's free. So I recommend this website. It can really enhance your learning, and you could use the materials to strengthen your knowledge about certain legal concepts. Another great person to follow on LinkedIn. By the way, if you don't have a LinkedIn account, get yourself a LinkedIn account yesterday. It's a huge resource for anyone who wants to keep up with a particular subject or with a particular field. You don't need to post anything yourself if you don't feel like doing it, but there are so many great inspirational people that you can follow on LinkedIn, so I really highly recommend it. And one of those is Dr. Sally Penny, MBE. She's a practicing barrister at law. She's an author of 16 books and host of a Talking Law podcast. And she also has a newsletter which you can sign up to. And in this newsletter, it's called the Law and Guidance newsletter. She posts updates about legal cases and developments in the law. The articles are written in a very simple language, so you don't need to be a lawyer to understand those. She discusses things like remote hearings, reporting child abuse. This is Dr. Sally Penny, MBE, practicing barrister. I really recommend her newsletter on LinkedIn called The Law and Guidance Newsletter. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. I hope you found it useful. All the links can be found in the video description. And next week, I am going to talk about the difference between the DPI, DCI, DPSI and DipTrans. So if you want to find out what do all of those mysterious words and letters mean, I will be discussing it next week, and you will be able to just learn a bit more about which qualification might be the best for you if you are wishing to pursue a particular career. So thank you so much again for watching. Keep safe, keep learning and keep growing. Ciao!